Sound check test. The committee will come to order. As we have heard in our meetings outside of Washington, the American people face a number of challenges. We have already advanced a number of solutions out of this committee to help, but there is more to do. Under the leadership of Speaker Johnson, House Republicans are continuing to work for the American people. We are focused on helping working families create a more prosperous and secure future for themselves and their communities. The bills we will consider today are real solutions to real problems faced by real Americans. Everything from helping protect the privacy of veterans coming home, to helping more folks find a job, to supporting our fellow citizens who are trying to put their lives back together after a disaster. The first bill we will consider is the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act, introduced by Representative Stubbe. Along with our colleague from Florida, Representative Thompson and Panetta, have also been leaders on this issue and ensuring help gets to those in need. This package builds on 3 pieces of bipartisan legislation to help families recover in the aftermath of a disaster. First, it offers important relief to victims of disasters across the country, including Hurricane Ian last year, which was the costliest storm in Florida history and which claimed countless lives. This bill will help those individuals and families deduct disaster losses against their tax bill. This bill also exempts from taxes the disaster relief payments received by victims of recent wildfires in California and Hawaii, as well as the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio last February. Washington does not need to add to the burden these communities face by demanding a cut of the money meant to rebuild what a disaster destroyed. Long after the news cameras have already left, this bill will help those families and communities put back the pieces of their lives and rebuild stronger than before. The second bill was introduced by Representative Steele and Panetta. It creates a global trade specialist position at Customs and Border Protection. The creation of this position will improve CBP's ability to enforce America's trade laws and rules. As our trading relationships change, CBP needs the ability to respond to change as it happens, not years later. This bill will help give CBP the manpower to hold our trade partners accountable for the benefit of American workers, farmers, and small businesses. Next, the committee will consider the Moving Americans Privacy Protection Act, introduced by Representative Waltz and Pascrell. The bill requires Customs and Border Protection to remove personal information like Social Security and passport numbers from shipping manifest and related documents before making such documents public. All of this information can be taken by thieves to steal identities and benefits. Veterans coming home from a tour of duty deserve our deepest thanks. Failing to protect their most valuable information as they come back is a slap in the face. This bill will help fix this problem for our veterans and all Americans moving back to the United States. The Bridge for Workers Act is sponsored by Work and Welfare Subcommittee Chairman LaHood and Ranking Member Davis. Unemployment insurance is meant to help people without a job get through a rough patch and find a new job to support themselves and their family. This bill makes a small correction that allows job placement services to be extended to everyone on unemployment insurance, not just those most likely to exhaust all their benefits. It also strengthens program integrity by ensuring claimants are complying with eligibility rules. The last bill we will consider is the Clergy Act, introduced by former Speaker Kevin McCarthy and our Tax Subcommittee Ranking Member Mike Thompson. Every year, around 2,000 members of the clergy opt out of contributing to and receiving Social Security. However, this decision is irreversible under current law. Upon enactment, this bill would create a temporary window where clergy members can opt back into the Social Security system, similar to what Congress did in the late 1990s. I urge my colleagues to support these bipartisan solutions to make a real difference in the lives of working families. And I'm now pleased to recognize the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today is our first gathering since our esteemed colleague, Trade Subcommittee Ranking Member Earl Blumenauer, announced that this will be his last term on the dais. First, Ranking Member Blumenauer, we want to say thank you. Earl has led the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. Pleased he arrived when he did. I thought he was faking modesty. Earl has led the Ways and Means Trade Committee through tremendous triumphs and has been a leading voice in holding administrations, corporations, and our trading partners accountable. Enforce these trade agreements. Your leadership has protected American workers through USMCA, delivered historic climate action with the Inflation Reduction Act, and built a better future for so many in America and indeed around the world. We will not be the same without you, and we will think of you whenever we see a bike pen. I certainly have been grateful for your friendship and loyalty, as well as your leadership, and I know I speak for our colleagues on both sides of the aisle when I say you will be greatly missed in the halls of this Congress and for sure in the next Congress. We thank you for your remarkable work and friendship. Before I turn to the bills under consideration today, Mr. Chairman, there has been some discussion of siphoning off of our jurisdiction to empower a temporary commission. I believe we share a protective instinct toward this committee and would therefore urge the use of the regular order. Ours is the oldest, most venerable committee of the House of Representatives. People spend careers vying to become members of this committee. The Social Security Act was developed and passed on this dais, and we have maintained continual oversight over its programs for 88 years since Social Security's inception. Bypassing the regular order and circumventing this committee is a dangerous precedent. But more than that, to do so, we need to make sure that what is best for the American people still resides within this committee. It requires the expertise of our committee members. And I hope that you and the Republican majority will join me in opposing this misguided position. I want to say that as one who has been here through these commissions over the years, they tend to be quickly forgotten, including Simpson-Bowles. That being said, I want to thank you for holding the markup today. Each of these bills includes real input from both sides and represents genuine agreement amongst members with deep expertise in policy. These bills under consideration will help Americans facing personal and financial loss from wildfires and support our ongoing efforts to bolster enforcement of U.S. trade laws. We will also consider legislation previously passed by this committee to make technical corrections to unemployment insurance to keep workers eligible for this critical support. Finally, extending Social Security protection to certain members of the clergy, another example of why we want to protect our jurisdiction, is, in my view, an easy glide path to the floor and these measures becoming law. But when I thought about the supplemental funding package that we're now witnessing, I know that this committee work this morning is not being politicized as that package is. So, Mr. Chairman, we're pleased that we are going to commit to protecting these bills from partisan politics, and we will not let the bipartisan process be tainted. I know we have the support of members of this committee for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I also want to share the same comment of the Ranking Member of Mr. Blumenauer. Since your first elected public office, I guess at 24, to the Oregon State House, you've been serving the people for the passions that you believe in, and it's been an honor to serve with you, and we're grateful for the time that we've been able to share. So we're going to miss you and also all those bike pins that you wear every day. So. Our first order of business is H.R. 5863, the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2023. I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for bringing this bill before the committee. It's a much-needed issue in my district and all the disasters that we've had across the country, and I'm honored that members like Mr. Panetta have joined as co-sponsors because of the disasters in California and we've seen all across the country. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to bring it before the committee today. H.R. 5863, the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2023, we have the opportunity today to deliver real results for millions of Americans across Florida and the rest of our country. On September 28, 2022, Southwest Florida experienced Hurricane Ian, one of the most devastating hurricanes to ever hit my state, killing nearly 150 people. NOAA ranks Hurricane Ian as the third most costly hurricane in U.S. history and the costliest in Florida, causing over $112 billion in damages. A little over a month ago, we marked the first anniversary of this devastating storm. Through no fault of their own, Floridians and many other Americans in Southwest U.S. continue on an expensive road to recover following Hurricane Ian. Over the past year, we've delivered several substantial wins for Floridians, but there is a lot more that needs to be done. The most recurring and pressing issue I hear about in my district is that the Suncoast is still waiting for Congress to do its job. 1 year after the landfall of Hurricane Ian, Congress has yet to provide much-needed tax relief or disaster relief for those impacted financially by Hurricane Ian. Disaster relief through changes to tax policy has been a very common congressional response to disasters. We have passed disaster-related tax relief on 8 separate occasions going back to 2002. This is a common-sense bill that provides needed tax relief for disaster victims. I've received thousands of letters, calls, and pleas for help from people in my district who have incurred tens of thousands of dollars in recovery expenses and are having a hard time getting ahead. This bill merely continues longstanding congressional practices related to disaster relief and would provide much-needed relief for my district. I've had the opportunity to travel in my district as of late, and I would conservatively estimate that about 25% of my district still has tarps on their roofs. I had the opportunity to fly with mosquito control in Lee County a couple months ago, and there are still homes that are gone from their foundations where people are living in RVs. It's a long road ahead, and it's been over a year, so this is much needed help for these people. This bipartisan bill requires that disasters like Hurricane Ian should be treated as a qualified disaster event for purposes of determining the tax treatment of certain disaster-related personal casualty losses. My bipartisan legislation would allow Americans who were subjected to damage from federally declared disasters to claim such losses without itemizing such deductions. Moreover, such losses would not have to exceed 10% of the claimant's adjusted gross income to qualify. This is language that was adopted from the Taxpayer Certainty and Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2020. Section 2 of my bill takes the Taxpayer Certainty and Disaster Tax Relief Act and extends the deadline of qualified disaster area from 60 days after the enactment of that act to major disasters occurring 60 days after the enactment of this bill before us here today. So it's not just Hurricane Ian victims who will benefit from this deduction. It's the millions of Americans around the country who, through no fault of their own, were victims of federally declared disasters. Wildfires in California, fires in Maui, the train derailment in Ohio. Sections 3 and 4 of the bills also include bipartisan disaster priorities for victims of wildfires and chemical spills that have hurt millions of Americans over the past several years. For Floridians, we know that the recovery from Hurricane Ian is far from over. Just one of the counties in my district is still owed nearly $100 million from the storm last year. Despite experiencing numerous hurricanes yearly, Floridians are resilient. I've been working tirelessly on disaster relief legislation and will continue to do whatever is within my power as a member of Congress, as long as it takes for Floridians to recover from the various storms that has decimated our communities. I'm pleased that this bill also includes disaster relief priorities for other members of this committee whose districts and states have also suffered, and I'm confident that this legislation will garner strong bipartisan support from my colleagues of this committee. The Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2023 is expansive to cover numerous natural disasters that have occurred, not pick and choose, but between just my district and another district. This is a bill that should pass out of this House with overwhelming bipartisan support. Disaster relief is not a Democrat problem or a Republican problem. The constituents of my district and the districts of many of you represent are in need of help, and today the Ways and Means Committee should have the courage to do the right thing and pass a bill that provides real relief to Americans from every corner of this great nation. Thank you for the opportunity to present this bill.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me yield to the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, and thank him for his leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Neal, for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this markup up today. The bill before us contains a range of provisions intended to help survivors of natural disasters or other catastrophes. Disasters affect every state and every district in our country, and it is one of our most fundamental responsibilities as members of Congress, as neighbors, and as Americans to support one another in these times of need. This legislation helps Americans who have suffered personal and financial losses in wildfires, train derailments, and other disasters. It provides critical assistance to taxpayers navigating one of the most difficult times of their lives. And I'm particularly grateful that this bill includes my bipartisan legislation ensuring that wildfire survivors do not pay taxes on payments they receive from the Fire Victims Trust. As my colleagues know, this has been a priority of mine for a while now. No fire survivor should pay taxes on the compensation they're entitled to. And I'm very grateful, Mr. Chairman, to you and to your staff, Mr. Neal, to you and your team, and to my partner on this bill, Representative LaMalfa, for working with me throughout the process to get this done. I'd like to note for the record that the text before us has been adjusted to ensure that payments for emotional distress from the trust are also non-taxable, which I know has been a great concern to my constituents and to those affected up and down California. This legislation is incredibly important to thousands of disaster survivors across our country, and I'm hopeful it will receive swift consideration from the whole House. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5863, the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2023. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which will be distributed which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members have before them three joint committee documents, JCX 45, which describes the underlying legislation, HR 5863, JCX 49, which describes the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute, and JCX 50, which provides the joint committee staff's budget estimates of the budgetary effects of this legislation. The legislation does generally three things. It reinstates the above-the-line deduction for personal casualty losses, which the Congress had previously enacted related to certain disasters in 2020, and it extends this to cover disasters for the period January 1st, 2020 through 60 days after the date of enactment of this proposal. It also provides an exclusion from gross income for wildfire relief payments made to individuals for wildfires in federally declared disaster areas. As was noted by Mr. Thompson, the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute specifically broadens the scope of payments that qualify to include any payment. And this applies to payments made in 2020 through the years 2025. And then lastly, the legislation treats East Palestine train derailment payments made to individuals as excludable from income. And this applies to payments made to those individuals after February 3rd of this year. The Joint Committee staff has estimated the budgetary effect of this legislation as a reduction in revenues of $4.9 billion. That concludes my brief description. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you, sir. Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you describe the type of relief that the IRS generally provides after any disaster as a matter of course, and what relief is provided by this legislation?
Okay. Yes, Mr. Stubbe. The Congress has provided in the Internal Revenue Code that the IRS can grant additional time to file tax returns and tax payments. That's a base administrative provision, and the IRS generally in the past has used that authority when disasters have been declared. Then as underlying provisions of law, Section 165 of the code provides a deduction for casualty losses. That's what your legislation would amend and expand. It provides for an exclusion of qualified disaster relief payments under Section 139 of the code. And again, this legislation expands that in the case of wildfire payments and the East Palestine rail derailment payments, as I noted. And other provisions in the code that relate to disasters relate to retirement plans and IRAs. the Congress has provided that in certain cases, hardship withdrawals can be made from these plans without incurring 10% withdrawal penalties, and that subsequent to major disasters, that withdrawals can be made and then repaid later, again, without being subject to early withdrawal penalties. The legislation before you today does not affect the underlying provisions related to retirement plans.
You had mentioned the casualty loss deduction. Has Congress provided that type of relief after prior disasters?
Oh, yes, in multiple times, and as I believe you noted in your opening statement, most recently in legislation passed in late 2020.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Further technical questions? Mr. Winstrup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Berthel, with respect to payments from disaster liability funds or from third parties, how do the changes in this bill compare to the tax treatment of disaster relief payments by FEMA?
Under Section 139 of the code, there's generally an exclusion for reimbursements for necessary personal family expenses, for rehabilitation of personal residences, or payments by federal, state, or local government to promote general welfare. An expansion here, which I think is the thrust of your question, is that payments made by a non-governmental agency for related to expenses, or in the case of wildfire, as Mr. Thompson had noted, emotional distress, will also be excludable, notwithstanding that they're not paid by a federal, state, or local government as a general welfare payment.
Thank you.
Are there any further technical questions? Seeing none, we will move to strike the last word. Mr. Buchanan is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word, and I also want to recognize my colleague for his leadership. It's huge, not just to his district, my district, but Florida and across the country. I want to thank you for holding this markup today and considering these important bills, the Federal Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2023, because it will help my constituents in Florida and all of Florida and all our constituents that are impacted across the country with these unbelievable disasters. Unfortunately, hurricanes like Ian in the fall of 22 and Idella just a few months ago have caused billions of dollars in damage, with many of my constituents on the hook to foot the bill as they are just trying to dig out from an unbelievable disastrous situation. Hurricane Ian alone caused nearly $113 billion in damage across Florida, with some entire communities completely wiped off the map. Hurricane Idella is estimated to have caused about $20 billion in damage last couple of months, and we must do more for our constituents so they can fully recover. There is more work that needs to be done to improve this pre-disastrous mitigation so that the cost after a natural disaster occurs do not continue to balloon the out-of-control cost, but allowing those Americans impacted by natural disasters to receive tax relief for personal casualty losses is a good start. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and the rest of the bills under consideration today, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the sponsors of this very important legislation, including my colleague, Mr. Thompson. I support the legislation considered today, and I hope that we can build on our work in the future to provide additional relief where it's needed, specifically as it relates to casualty loss deduction. Tens of thousands of homeowners in my district, Ranking Member Neal's, Joe Courtney's, in the Northeast are dealing with this unique issue that threatens their homes and, frankly, their finances as well. These homeowners, through no fault of their own, are dealing with crumbling home foundations. Unbeknownst to them, the concrete used in those foundations contain pyrrhotite, which we now know crumbles over time and pressure. Now they are dealing with exorbitant bills to replace their foundations. In 2017, we worked with the IRS to confirm that these costs were eligible to use the casualty loss deduction. Unfortunately, despite longstanding policy that allowed any qualified homeowner to use the deduction, it is currently and temporarily limited to damages incurred under a presidentially declared disaster. While this is especially harmful to those impacted by crumbling foundations, this limitation bars individuals from every part of the country from getting needed relief simply because their significant loss occurred outside of a presidential declared disaster. I want to commend again Representatives Crenshaw, Rogers, and Brownlee, who have introduced bipartisan legislation along with Mr. Courtney, to restore the full casualty loss deduction and allow every American the opportunity to recover from this disaster. Mr. Chairman, I indulge upon you and thank you again, and hope as the committee continues its work on disaster relief, we can work together with you on this bipartisan policy.
I thank the gentleman for his comments, and I certainly understand the interest in helping constituents to get back on their feet. That's what we all want to do, and be happy to work with you to try to find a path forward.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from the record from Congressman Doug LaMalfa in support of 4070 Disaster Mitigation and Tax Parity Act.
Without objection, so ordered.
I'll just speak briefly. The 3rd District of North Carolina has about 80% of our coastline, and while there are a lot of vacation homes, so much of the damage that occurs during a hurricane is not insured, and this will be a great relief for individuals who either cannot afford insurance or the insurance does not help enough to replace or even put costs back for what original costs were. So I just want to say thank you for bringing this legislation. It's going to be very, very critical for my district. With that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Doggett is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the authors of this legislation. While I'm supportive of this legislation, providing some relief to Americans who suffered lost property damage, perhaps an entire home, those who have suffered from hurricane damage in Florida, to wildfires, to the devastating storms in my own hometown of Austin, I do have two concerns. First, this committee continues to deny the need to address the root cause here, the contributing factor to intensified weather patterns, and that is the climate crisis. There's a very good reason why so many casualty insurers are fleeing some states. They recognize what this committee has refused to recognize, the growing harm of climate crisis that is very real. So long as this committee is bound by Republicans to fossilize thinking and fossil fuels, there will come a time when even the massive resources of the federal government will be insufficient to provide complete relief to those who suffer from natural disasters made so much worse by unnatural causes. I'm also share a second concern, and that is our fiscal situation. This bill is expensive. It is $5 billion. It is an expenditure through the tax code that is every bit as real as if the Appropriations Committee approved the handing out of checks to those who've been victims of these disasters. This $5 billion is part of a not very good day here in Congress for the deficit. Yes, Republicans talk about debt concerns when they're looking for an excuse to block new educational opportunity legislation or to strengthen health care. But that talk does not apply to what's happening here today, because in addition to this $5 billion, the first bill coming out of our new speaker is $12 billion in cutting resources for the effect of cutting resources for the Internal Revenue Service. Our colleagues will, of course, remember that the very first bill to come out of this Congress by Republicans, their top priority was to protect tax cheats. And today, their desperation to protect those cheats is so far-reaching that they will not agree to afford assistance to Israel unless the multi-million-dollar corporations and the wealthiest, most well-connected Americans in the country get protection from enforcement from the Internal Revenue Service. Cutting funding reverses a decade's worth of IRS budget cuts that have led to audit rates for large corporations being sliced in half, and audit rates for those making more than $1 million or more in annual income falling by 70%. We're headed back in that direction if this debt approach of Republicans prevails today, and I certainly hope that it will not. With the restored funding that we provided last year that they would eliminate, the IRS has been busy reversing the decline in high-end tax enforcement, ensuring those at the top pay what they owe like the rest of us. Thus far this year, they've been able to collect $160 billion in unpaid taxes from those who earned $1 million or more each year. Apparently, this has been too much for the new Speaker and the Republican majority because, once again, they are saying that their top priority today is to protect those tax sheets. So while it's important to address natural disasters and those who are victimized by them, it's equally important to address the root causes of those natural disasters and to avoid a fiscal disaster with more and more tax breaks and less enforcement by the Internal Revenue Service. I yield back.
Ms. Malliotakis is recognized to strike the last word.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just wanted to speak in support of this legislation. I also had a devastated district following Hurricane Sandy 11 years ago, so I understand what my colleague, Mr. Stubbe, is going through right now. And, you know, we spend so much money internationally and off to other countries. We really need to take care of our own, particularly when they're going through a tragedy like this. So many of my constituents at that time were left homeless. The foundations of their home were literally removed. And they lost everything that they had. And so particularly when Americans are facing a tragedy, a natural disaster like this, we need to be there for them. And that is exactly why Americans pay these taxes at the end of the day, is to support the needs of our communities. And so I gladly support this legislation, and I hope that it will receive bipartisan support today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my home state of California, wildfires pose a constant threat to families and homeowners, and these disasters cause billions of dollars in damage each year, and they're only getting worse. Across the U.S., working families often bear the brunt of extreme events tied to climate change. So I'm proud to support this bill to help provide tax relief for qualified disaster victims. Too many Californians have suffered in the wake of wildfires and other serious natural disasters, losing their homes, their possessions, and sometimes even their loved ones. I look forward to our committee advancing this bill that would allow survivors to focus on recovering and rebuilding in the wake of serious disasters. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Higgins is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Natural disasters impact every area of our country. Recently, we have seen torrential hurricanes, disastrous wildfires, and record-breaking floods. My community of Western New York experienced one of the worst blizzards in history, Winter Storm Elliott, in December of 2022. Blizzard conditions with hurricane-strength winds and 4 feet of lake-effect snow persisted for days. People were trapped in their homes, streets were impassable, emergency vehicles became stuck in the storm, and over 40 people lost their lives. These extreme weather events are devastating and take months or years to recover from. One tool the federal government has for such events is the personal casualty loss deduction, which helps ease the burden of sudden and unexpected loss. This bill will ensure those impacted by such storms can claim this deduction if the loss is due to a presidentially declared disaster between 2020 and 2023, including Winter Storm Elliott. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Sewell is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are now almost 10 months from the devastating January 12th tornadoes that hit my district and my hometown. One thing is clear: the people of Selma and Dallas County are resilient. From the very beginning, my biggest priority has been ensuring that Selma and Dallas County get the resources they need to recover and ensuring that our recovery is equitable. Together with our local, state, and federal partners, we have made significant progress since January 12th. This has truly been a team effort. The legislation before us today is just another example of making a valuable resource available to those still rebuilding from the storm. The road to recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. The work undertaken by the Ways and Means Committee is transformational for our constituents and all Americans. H.R. 5863 is no exception. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Chu is recognized to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chair, I would like to express my support for one of the bills included in this legislation, the Protect Innocent Victims of Taxation After Fire Act, led by our colleague, Representative Mike Thompson, and which I co-sponsor. This bill would provide critical support for victims of horrific wildfires, including 2018's Camp Fire, the deadliest and most destructive fire in California history. It claimed 85 lives, burned almost 19,000 structures, and all but destroyed the entire town of Paradise. Victims of this and other severe wildfires in California are entitled to wildfire relief payments from a settlement fund, but that restitution is subject to federal taxes. This bill would rightly ensure that victims, many of whom lost everything in these fires, can benefit from the full value of their settlement without being hit by a tax bill. I also want to emphasize that this bill is important for more than just the victims of these Northern California fires. In 2020, my district experienced one of the largest wildfires in Southern California's history, the Bobcat Fire. This occurred within the San Gabriel Mountains, and thank goodness we did not see the same devastation in populated areas. We were fortunate that the firefighters did an amazing job and prevented the fire from moving through the densely populated foothills in my district. But with increasingly long and severe fire seasons, there will be other communities, whether in my district or in others, who will need the same assistance, which is why this bill has my support. However, I also want to take the opportunity to lament that the majority chose to assemble this package on their own without seeking cooperation and feedback from Democrats. As a result, this bill fails to include important disaster tax legislation like Representative Kustoff's and my bill, the Filing Relief for Natural Disasters Act, which would have provided much needed clarity to disaster victims facing filing deadlines. The IRS routinely extends tax filing deadlines for states that suffer natural disasters. In fact, all of Californians received a tax extension until November 16th, as a result of the major flooding we experienced earlier this year. But currently, the IRS has to wait for a federal disaster declaration in order to extend the deadline. This means that there would be a gap of days or weeks between the state declaration and a federal declaration, creating uncertainty for tax filers, especially those who experience a disaster during tax filing season. They deserve immediate certainty that their deadline will be extended so that they can focus on their recovery. And I ask that Chairman work with us to address this issue in bipartisan legislation in the future. I yield back.
Mr. Panetta is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing up this critical disaster tax legislation and for focusing on the substantive work that this committee is charged to lead on. I specifically want to thank my friend Greg Stubbe for pushing this tax relief bill for victims of natural disasters. While I know that he has been a very, very strong supporter of victims of Hurricane Ian, I am grateful that today we are taking care of all of those who need relief. In my district on the Central Coast of California, it has experienced more than its share of disasters. The CZU complex fire in 2020 burned more than 80,000 acres and destroyed 700 structures just in Santa Cruz County alone. It was one of the most destructive fires in our state's history and the biggest in Santa Cruz County. In that same August, we had the River, Dolan, and Carmel fires that burned another 180,000 acres and destroyed over another 100 structures just in Monterey County. In a bipartisan fashion, though, this committee, led by Select Revenue Measures Chairman Thompson, made sure that we provided tax relief for victims of these fires and all recent disasters. Since then, my district continues to be hit with even more extreme weather events, including 2 atmospheric rivers that absolutely dumped on my district earlier this year, causing unprecedented flooding, damages, and even deaths on the Central Coast of California. For any damages not covered by insurance, the TCGA does provide deductions unless the loss is at least 10% of adjusted gross income. For those with smaller uninsured losses, they are unable to take these deductions. I'm glad that today's legislation removes this threshold for all victims of federally declared disasters, including this year's winter storms. I also specifically want to voice my support for the legislation in this bill championed by Tax Subcommittee Ranking Member Mike Thompson and my good friend Doug LaMalfa to make wildfire settlement payments tax-free. My district is now home to many victims who relocated after losing their homes in the 2018 Camp Fire, and I believe that we must do everything we can to make them whole. Victims who have lost homes have rightfully been awarded payments from the Fire Victim Trust, but they face steep tax bills because of it. Victims are even taxed on attorney fees, which the IRS counts as income even though it is never received. Today, we're doing the right thing by making sure that these payments would not be taxed. These victims have been through too much, and they need to focus on rebuilding their lives free from additional tax burdens. I'm proud to support this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there additional members to strike the last word? See none. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? See none. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by... If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably reports H.R. 5863 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 5863 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Yes. Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Yes. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller, yes. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Ms. Tinney. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Higgins. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Del Bene. Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer? Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Mr. Evans, yes. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider, yes. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta, yes. Ms. Tinney? Mr. Carey? Mr. Pascrell? Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Byer? Chairman Smith?
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
How is Mr. Byer recorded?
Mr. Byer is not recorded. Mr. Byer, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 38. The noes are 0.
There being 38 ayes and 0 noes, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5863 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 5863 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. We will now recess until after the first vote series and then start promptly back. Thank you.
Test.
You ready?
Good.
The committee will come to order. Our next order of business is H.R. 5862 to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 relating to authority of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to consolidate, modify, or reorganize customs revenue functions. I will now recognize a gentlewoman from California, Ms. Steele, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak in favor of H.R. 5862, the Bipartisan Global Trade Specialist Act, and I'm proud to have introduced with our colleague, Representative Panetta. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 created the Department of Homeland Security, the youngest but third largest cabinet department, and established the CBP, the largest federal law enforcement agency within DHS. As we celebrate DHS at 20 years, reforms are needed to improve CBP's global trade operations. For over 5 years, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has requested new authority to create a global trade specialist position within its Office of International Trade to improve enforcement on U.S. trade law and facilitate legitimate trade. If enacted, my bill will make narrowly tailored updates to help CBP respond to ever-evolving trade threats by better utilizing existing personnel within CBP. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate passed the bills that would grant CBP the authority to create a global trade specialist position, but neither bill was enacted into law. The Ways and Means Committee this year has heard hearing testimony about how a global trade specialist position within CBP will better serve the needs of American workers and safeguard supply chains. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 5862 to update the titles of key trade personnel at CBP and improve enforcement of our trade laws. I yield back.
Mr. Neal, the ranking member is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you. I yield my time to Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal, and of course, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to co-lead this bipartisan legislation, the Global Trade Specialist Act, with my good friend and fellow California Representative Michelle Steele. Now, I think as we all know, Customs and Border Protection has an important role to play, especially in supporting and facilitating trade. Therefore, it should have the proper authority to modernize their staffing as the trade environment evolves. Now, currently, CBP's Office of International Trade has several distinct but separate trade positions. This includes import specialists, international trade analysts, management and program analysts, economists, auditors, and attorneys. These jobs obviously help CBP execute enforcing U.S. trade laws, facilitate trade, and protect the American economy. But there is a position missing, a global trade specialist, a position that could help track supply chains and target imports. CBP has worked to create this position that combines several different trade facilitation and enforcement positions. Unfortunately, and as you heard from my colleague Ms. Steele, the CBP does not have the flexibility or legal authority to hire for this position. Our legislation would give CBP the authority to consolidate, modify, and reorganize customs revenue functions to make this position a reality. It would give CBP and its employees more flexibility to modernize our trade workforce, help CBP retain employees, and build institutional knowledge. The new position would allow CBP to realign and reshape the workforce as it responds to the evolving trade environment and new workforce functions. It would also allow for the better utilization and focus on existing resources for customs revenue functions, and it would equip trade employees to more effectively execute trade enforcement and compliance operations. It would also provide position flexibility that would enrich these jobs through ongoing training and rotational assignments. Employees in this new position would experience the benefits of an upward career advancement, clearly defined career paths, and professional development opportunities. By making trade facilitation jobs more attractive and rewarding, This legislation would enhance CBP's ability to recruit and retain staff to meet the mandated staffing levels set forth in the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And lastly, this legislation is supported by the National Treasury Employees Union, who represents CBP's workers. I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank Representative Steele for bringing up this truly bipartisan bill that is the product of good faith collaboration. I fully support this legislation. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5862 to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 relating to authority of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to consolidate, modify, or reorganize customs revenue functions. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Mr. Sam Malopoulos to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5862 would modify the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to allow Customs and Border Protection to consolidate certain job titles related to customs revenue collection by adding functions to existing positions or establishing new job titles for such personnel. Under current law, CBP may not consolidate any current job functions with functions related to customs revenue collection. H.R. 5862 would allow new flexibility in existing with respect to job titles and functions while maintaining the provisions in existing law that do not allow CBP to reduce staffing levels or to change the overall responsibilities of these personnel. This bill is consistent with the request that CBP has made for several years for legislation that allows the creation of a new global trade specialist position that would consolidate 6 narrowly defined existing positions. CBP has explained that the global trade specialist position would help modernize CBP's operations with a better trained and more flexible workforce that can better address modern enforcement challenges, while also providing CBP employees with increased opportunities for career advancement.
Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Blumenauer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say I appreciate the kind words from you and Mr. Neal. If I'd known everybody was going to be so polite to me, I would have retired years ago. It's much appreciated.
There's about 14 people here who wish
Yes,
to
yeah, well, I know that there's some real estate to be obtained. I appreciate having this legislation come before us. I think it's really important that we focus on the infrastructure of Customs and Border Patrol. This is a small step in the right direction. I hope the committee will favorably respond to the legislation we have dealing with de minimis. It's now 3 million packages a day that's going through here. That's just overwhelming the Customs and Border Patrol, and I hope we can do some things to relieve some of their workforce burdens and be able to do their job better. In the meantime, this is an important step forward, and I'm proud to support it.
Any additional members wish to strike the last word? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably reports H.R. 5862 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 5862 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan?
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller, yes. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Ms. Tinney. Ms. Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Davis. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, yes. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, yes. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans.
Yes.
Mr. Evans, yes. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Davis. Mr. Schneider. Chairman Smith.
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
How is Mr. Stubbe recorded?
Mr. Stubbe is not recorded. Mr. Stubbe, yes.
Do you want me to? The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 40, the noes are 0.
There being 40 ayes and 0 noes, the motion is agreed to and H.R. 5862 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 5862 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 1568, the Moving America's Privacy Protection Act. Today, the Ways and Means Committee is following through on our member day hearing and moving common sense and bipartisan custom bills out of this committee. We will be marking up the Moving Americans Privacy Protection Act introduced by Congressman Waltz and Pascrell to end the needless disclosure of private information by Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and help ease the transition for our veterans, military personnel, and federal employees moving home from abroad. If enacted, the Moving Americans Privacy Protection Act would require CBP to remove personally identifiable information like Social Security numbers, passport numbers, and home addresses before publicly releasing shipping manifest data. Every year, thousands of Americans return home to the United States and must ship their personal belongings back home. CBP is required by law to publicly disclose vessel manifest data regarding those shipments. Those manifests contain personal information about Americans that absolutely should remain private to protect against identity theft, a crime that is all too prevalent. Last year alone, the Federal Trade Commission received over 1.1 million reports of identity theft. Government policy should protect against this rather than make the problem worse. Under this legislation, Americans coming back to the United States will no longer have to jump through hoops to protect their private information or wonder if coming back home also means turning that information over to identity thieves. I appreciate the leadership of Representative Waltz and Pascrell on this issue, and I urge all my colleagues to vote yes on this critical piece of legislation, and I now recognize the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to assume the time of Mr. Pascrell. I think you hit the right notes. We're also, as you noted, marking up the Americans Privacy Protection Act, which is, I would reiterate, would require CBP to remove personally identifiable information from cargo as it manifests before public disclosure. With this committee's constitutional authority over trade, which we always have to guard, Ways and Means Democrats will continue to work in leading on trade policy and enforcement to protect American workers. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1568, the Moving America's Privacy Protection Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Mr. Sam Malopoulos to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1568 has 2 sections. Section 1 sets forth the short title. Section 2 would require Customs and Border Protection to remove personally identifiable information, including Social Security numbers, passport numbers, and home addresses from shipping manifests before access to those manifests is made public. Under current law, CBP is only required to withhold shipping manifest information from public disclosure if it finds that the disclosure is likely to pose a threat to personal injury, property damage, or would be excludable under FOIA. These requirements would not change. However, in all other circumstances, CBP will only withhold PII at an individual's request. The new requirement is for CBP to remove personally identifiable information without the need for a request from an individual. This would take effect 30 days after enactment.
Thank you. Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, does anyone wish to strike the last word? Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I'd like to speak in support of this bill, which would require Customs and Border Protection to scrub cargo manifests for sensitive personal information, like Social Security or passport numbers, before releasing the data to the public. Since I came to Congress, I've been an outspoken advocate for the right to privacy, from advocating for the need to protect Americans from warrantless searches to the need to enact federal data privacy legislation. The loss of privacy rights and protections can have dire consequences. Just according to the FBI, in 2021 alone, there were over 51,000 identity theft victims who were defrauded out of $278 million. People should feel confident that their sensitive personal information is never publicly disclosed, especially by the federal government. So I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. Are there additional members that would like to strike the last word? Seeing none, we will move to amendments. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1568 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 1568 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Yes.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller, yes. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Ms. Tinney. Ms. Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal.
Yes.
Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, yes. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, yes. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer.
Yes.
Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans.
Yes.
Mr. Evans, yes. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Schweikert.
Yes.
Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Schneider. Chairman Smith.
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 41, the noes are 0.
There being 41 ayes and 0 noes, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1568 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 1568 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5861, the Bridge for Workers Act. I will now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased we are marking up the Bridge for Workers Act, which I introduced with my colleague and friend Danny Davis of Illinois, the ranking member of the Work and Welfare Subcommittee. This bill clarifies the reemployment services can be provided to all unemployment insurance claimants, not just those most likely to exhaust their benefits, to help unemployed workers get back into the workforce faster. This legislation builds upon the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, where we made a significant step forward in helping those unemployed through no fault of their own by pairing unemployment benefits with services. The Reemployment Services and Eligibility Assessments Program provides a variety of services to unemployment claimants, such as job search assistance, employability assessments, and assistance with resume writing and interviewing. The program is designed to improve coordination with the existing workforce development system and, most importantly, is focused on outcomes. It requires states to use evidence-based interventions to focus funds on proven services. It also strengthens program integrity by ensuring claimants are complying with eligibility rules, including the federal requirement that a UI claimant must be able to work, available to work, or actively seeking work. Reemployment services have been demonstrated to improve employment outcomes and reduce the number of weeks that participants receive unemployment benefits. In this 116th Congress, my Democrat colleagues led a markup of this very same bill, and it passed the House by a very large bipartisan margin. At a time when we have 1.5 unfilled jobs for every unemployed worker, this effort is especially crucial now. Many states have rebranded unemployment to reemployment and focused efforts to promote rapid reentry into the workforce because it is better for workers and their families. In fact, many states have focused efforts to promote rapid reemployment for new UI claimants. This bill gives states the flexibility they need to make reemployment services a successful tool for those that have lost their job through no fault of their own. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to work with my friend from Illinois to again advance this useful technical correction to the rules for state reemployment and services programs. The correction would ensure that our reemployment services programs operate effectively and as we intended in our original bipartisan legislation. As a result, states will be able to provide reemployment services to individuals who would most benefit from additional help to get back into the workforce. As we know, this correction first passed our committee and then the full House on an overwhelming bipartisan vote in 2019, and Senate Republicans have prevented it from becoming law. I hope and expect that this new action means that Chairs Smith and LaHood have a plan to overcome Senate Republican objections and enact this long overdue change. Without the Bridge for Workers Act, we continue to risk disrupting both the services that help some get back to work a little faster and also the research that helps us understand what actually works. American workers heroically overcame obstacles and returned to work after the global pandemic, and they deserve our support. Research shows one way we can help people get back to work faster is to ensure that they get simple services like job market information or resume help. Even a week or two of getting a paycheck instead of an unemployment benefit makes a difference for a household budget. The basic income support provided by earned unemployment insurance benefits is also key to ensuring that workers can search for new jobs. I was proud to see that our home state of Illinois recently received over $11 million from our investment in the American Rescue Plan Act to modernize their information technology systems in a smart way that prevents fraud and help workers. I hope this bill is just the first committee effort to provide common sense help so that Americans can work and support their families. A good next step would be to enact the President's plan to address the child care cliff and keep child care available for working parents. The cutoff of federal support for many child care centers is likely to force many parents to quit their jobs, impeding our strong economic recovery. Parents and other workers also need universal paid family and medical leave. It is an embarrassment that some continue to block enactment of this essential leave that all other developed countries provide. And long term, we need to do much more to make sure caregivers can find, pay for, and keep child care. And that's why I joined with my colleagues, Senator Wyden and Representatives Bonamici, Moore, Plaskett, and Horsford, to introduce the Building Child Care for a Better Future Act that would make a significant long-term federal commitment to the child care we know parents and our economy need. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working with you to support workers and enact this bill promptly. Thank you very much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5861, the bridge.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Ms. Moore?
Strike the last word.
Oh, we're not there yet, but we'll get
You're not
there.
there yet?
Yep. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5861, the Bridge for Workers Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Cheryl Vinson to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal. H.R. 5861, the Building on Reemployment Improvements to Deliver Good Employment for Workers, or Bridge for Workers Act, makes a technical correction to the Reemployment Services and Eligibility Assessment Program, referred to as RESEA, to provide additional flexibility to states to help unemployed workers get back into the workforce more quickly. Under RESEA, funding is provided to states for evidence-based interventions that addressed individual reemployment needs of unemployment insurance claimants, as well as to prevent and detect improper payments. Currently, the Department of Labor has interpreted the underlying statute as limiting reemployment services to a narrow group of claimants. However, since 2018, appropriations bills have included language to accomplish this change made by this bill, while the committee has simultaneously sought a permanent legislative fix. The Bridge for Workers Act accomplishes this by amending Section 306A of the Social Security Act to clarify that reemployment services can be extended to all unemployment insurance claimants, not just those profiled as most likely to exhaust their benefits. As reflected on the green sheet distributed yesterday, the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute modifies H.R. 5861 as introduced. On page 2, lines 6 through 7, to replace the term unemployment compensation with regular compensation, and on page 2, line 10, to insert an effective date, making the provision effective upon the date of enactment. Both changes are consistent with the intent of the provisions to correct references and make conforming changes. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough, and I am happy to answer technical questions.
Thank you. Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Hearn is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word. Federal unemployment compensation is designed to be temporary and should only serve as a partial wage replacement for individuals actively seeking work. Unfortunately, this system is deeply flawed. I'm grateful for the work that has already been done by this committee to recoup funds lost to unemployment fraud during the COVID pandemic. Fraud which was allowed to flourish thanks to a lack of oversight from House Democrats. The Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act, which we marked up and passed earlier this year, was an important first step towards correcting these mistakes. Now that we have addressed the rampant fraud, it's time to work towards meaningful, long-term solutions to get people back to work. Throughout the pandemic, my Democrat colleagues consistently pushed an anti-work agenda, encouraging people to stay home. According to U.S. Chamber of Commerce, 38 states have a lower percentage of their labor workforce participation than before the pandemic, and the national labor force participation rate is 0.7 percentage points below pre-pandemic levels. Every day I hear from constituents who are suffering due to workforce shortages, and now I'm not alone. It's time we get Americans back to work. The H.R. 5861 Bridge for Workers Act will ensure that unemployed workers are rejoining the workforce and will provide them with the necessary resources to stay there. I support this legislation. I yield back.
Ms. Sewell is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My top priority as a member of Congress has always been to expand economic opportunity and to fight for jobs in my district. I'm glad that we're considering this common sense legislation today to expand access to re-employment services and help people get back to work. While many areas of the country have bounced back from COVID-19, too many people in rural America, and I can tell you in rural Alabama, are still struggling to find work. The services provided to job seekers as a result of re-employment service grants are invaluable to workers trying to get back on their feet. I believe that this legislation will help to jumpstart the livelihood of people in my community and throughout this nation. I'm proud to support this bill as we make sure that all people receive unemployment benefits, are able to access the resources from the Re-Employment Services Program. The quicker people get back to work, the quicker they can provide for their families and regain financial security. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Smucker is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to thank Mr. LaHood, Mr. Davis for the work on this legislation, which is a great common sense idea to help individuals to get back to work, achieve their dreams, and provide for their families. I've also long advocated for policies that will help more Americans participate in the workforce. I have several pieces of legislation, such as the USA Workforce Tax Credit Act, which would create a tax credit for employers that help pay for apprenticeship and other workforce development programs. Legislation to help justice involve Americans successfully enter the workforce. There's a lot that we can do to help ensure that more people are participating in jobs. And the number one challenge that I hear from employers is finding people to fill jobs that are available. So we need individuals in the workforce, we need their talents, we need their skills, and of course, they will best provide for their families by being connected with a great paying job. So the bill, it's a great example, as I mentioned, of a common sense tweak to the existing law that has potential to have tremendous impact for Americans who are struggling to find work. It just simply ensures that all individuals collecting unemployment insurance benefits can receive these reemployment services. And those services, by the way, include one-on-one engagement to determine which jobs, in-demand jobs, available jobs, a claimant of unemployment may be eligible for. provides job search assistance and other career services as well. And as was already mentioned, today that's not available to everyone on unemployment. So this is important. We shouldn't wait to provide these kind of services until individuals are about ready to enter the workforce. It should be available to everyone. So again, I'd like to thank Mr. LaHood, Mr. Davis for the great work on this piece of legislation. I urge support for the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Chu is recognized to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word. I offer my support for H.R. 5861, the Bridge for Workers Act, which makes an important change to unemployment benefits that would help Americans get the support they need to re-enter the workforce. The Department of Labor provides reemployment services and eligibility assessment grants to state unemployment insurance offices to help unemployed workers get back to work. These benefits and workforce development tools include job search assistance, career counseling, financial literacy services, and assistance with resume writing and interviewing. Unfortunately, current law states that these funds can only be accessed once a worker is deemed likely to exhaust their benefits, preventing many unemployed workers from getting this valuable assistance when they need it. Research shows us that UI beneficiaries who receive unemployment reemployment services are significantly less likely to exhaust their benefits and have shorter UI durations. Additionally, they were more successful in returning to work sooner and retaining their new job. Eliminating the restriction on when unemployed Americans can benefit from this assistance will help workers and employers alike, because we know that reemployment services have a positive long-term impact to beneficiaries' success. That's why I support this bill, which would allow states to use their federal reemployment services grant funding to provide support to any individual receiving unemployment benefits, not just those who are reaching the end of their benefits. This will give workers more tools to help them re-enter the workforce sooner and have greater success in their new jobs. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Ms. Moore is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word. I just want to thank Mr. LaHood and Mr. Davis for bringing this legislation forward. I want to say specifically that I hope that the fact that we're voting on this legislation today gives this committee notice that there are two kinds of workers that need assistance in re-entry into the workforce. I have often seen this so-called light touch effort being applied toward those workers who have serious barriers, and I want to associate myself with Mr. Davis's earlier comments. People have serious barriers, something like child care, geographic mismatch with the job opportunities, medical problems, mental health problems, cognitive disabilities, and the effort to reconnect them to work is a lot different than some of these other workers. And so while we're passing this initiative today, I hope we're mindful of the fact that we actually do need to resource a slew of initiatives that will help people get to work who have serious barriers. And where taking resources away from those people who only need a light touch is not fair, and this legislation will correct that, but it won't correct the serious dearth of help that we need to really get people back to work who want to work but have more sustainable barriers. And so with that, I would yield back and support, ask my colleagues to support H.R. 5861.
Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Seeing none, we will move on. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably reports H.R. 5861 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 5861 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller, yes. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Ms. Tinney. Ms. Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, yes. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer.
Yes.
Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans.
Yes.
Mr. Evans, yes. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Schneider. Chairman Smith.
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
How is Ms. Sanchez recorded?
Ms. Sanchez is not recorded. Ms. Sanchez, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 41, the noes are 0.
There being 41 ayes and 0 noes, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5861 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 5861 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 6068, the Clergy Act. Social Security is the cornerstone of a secure retirement for the 65 million Americans who receive a benefit check each month, and a promise to the 180 million Americans paying into the system with each paycheck. Americans from all walks of life, farmers, machinists, nurses, police officers, faith leaders, all count on Social Security to retire. Members of the clergy can opt out of contributing to and receiving Social Security benefits on the grounds of strongly held religious beliefs. Each year, around 2,000 clergy members choose to exercise this option, and under current law, once they leave the system, they cannot rejoin. Upon enactment, this bill would create a one-time window for clergy who wish to rejoin the system to opt back into participating in it. Clergy members faithfully offer hope, wisdom, and truth to their congregations week after week. Many Americans have stories of a clergy member walking with them through a tough period in their life. My own father was a pastor in my hometown, and I watched him give his time and his counsel to the members of our church. Our faith leaders deserve to retire with dignity after years of serving their congregation and community. I want to thank former Speaker McCarthy, Representative Thompson, and our 9 other committee colleagues who came together to introduce this bipartisan legislation. The last time Congress created a similar window for clergy members to rejoin the Social Security system was the late 1990s. This bill gives the same opportunity to a new generation of America's spiritual leaders. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I now recognize the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield my time to Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Neal, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate both of your very positive efforts to make sure that the Clergy Act, a bipartisan, common sense piece of legislation, advances in our committee. Current law allows members of the clergy to exempt themselves from participating in Social Security and Medicare if they have religious objections to receiving payments in the event of death, disability, old age, or retirement. This legislation would allow clergy members who chose to exempt themselves from Social Security and Medicare to opt back in and start paying Social Security and Medicare taxes on their earnings. Social Security is a fundamental source of income for many retirees and provides a substantial economic benefit in all of our districts. Clergy members with a change of heart should be given the opportunity to pay in and participate in this important program. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6068, the Clergy Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Sean Freeman to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the Committee on Ways and Means. H.R. 6068, as introduced by Representatives McCarthy and Thompson, both of California, allows for the permanent revocation of an exemption from payment of Self-Employment Contributions Act, or SECA, taxes on income associated with ministerial services performed by certain church ministers, members of a religious order, and Christian Science practitioners who, solely for the purposes of this walkthrough and any subsequent technical questions, will hereinafter collectively be referred to as clergy. Under current law, a member of the clergy can apply for an exemption from paying SECA taxes on income associated with his or her performance of ministerial services. These SECA tax exemptions must generally be granted early in the clergy member's ministry, and under current law, these exemptions are permanent once granted. As a consequence, these members of the clergy do not contribute to or receive benefits from the Social Security retirement or disability programs based on their own ministerial work histories. H.R. 6068 would provide members of the clergy who have been granted a SECA tax exemption for their ministerial income with a time-limited window to apply for a permanent revocation of that exemption. This window would begin following enactment and conclude on the due date of the federal income tax return of the applicant's second taxable year after December 31st, 2025. Any revocation would become effective in the first taxable year after December 31st, 2025, in or after which an applicant's revocation has been granted, at which point the member of the clergy would begin making SECA tax contributions based on their ministerial income, allowing for their subsequent participation in Social Security and associated federal programs. H.R. 6068 also requires the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, in consultation with the Commissioner of Social Security, to provide Congress with a plan of how to inform members of the clergy of their eligibility to revoke their SECA exemptions within 90 days of enactment. As described on the green sheet distributed yesterday, the amendment in the nature of a substitute modifies this reporting requirement by specifying that this plan must be submitted to the House Committee on Ways and Means and the Senate Committee on Finance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Neal, members of the committee. This concludes my walkthrough, and I welcome any questions of a technical nature related to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you. Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Ranking Member Neal.
So point of identification, Mr. Freeman, supportive clearly of the model that's been developed here, but do you recall the date in which Social Security was changed in the sense that at one time you could actually have claimed your Social Security benefit, and then if you decided to go back to work, you could repay what you would put back in and postpone the benefit?
Are you referring to what was generally known as file and suspend?
Yeah.
I do not recall the date offhand of when that occurred, but it was somewhat recent.
Yeah, and I also think there was a time when you actually could claim the benefit, and all of a sudden you decide. I think people during the recession, for example, in 2008, I think a lot of people claimed the benefit at 62 that had not planned to do that. But when they tried to repay the benefit and postpone retirement, I think that the law had been changed prior to that. Maybe if you could get some information.
I do believe it was prior to 2020.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any further technical questions? Seeing none, we will move to strike the last word. Mr. Smucker is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for raising this important issue before us today. I'd just like to offer my support as well. This, as you mentioned, creates an open time to allow pastors and other clergy members who opted out of Social Security in their youth to opt back into the system at their choice. And for those of us, I know both sides of the aisle care deeply about the solvency of Social Security. And I'm pleased that I believe the CBO score on this bill actually would benefit Social Security and would take a very, very small step, of course, but it would help make Social Security more solvent by allowing these individuals to pay into the system. They would need to pay 40 quarters to receive any Social Security benefit. And I also believe there's precedent for creating an opt-in window, but it hasn't happened since 1999. And so I think advancement of this bill will not only help more Americans prepare responsibly for their retirement, for individuals in this small category, but also would increase the pool of individuals paying into the system. So I urge strong support, and I yield back.
Mr. Larson is recognized to strike the last word.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your very thoughtful comments at the outset of this, and I want to applaud my colleague, Mr. Thompson, for his legislation and the spirit in which this is being taken up, because I think that's vitally important to this committee. Mr. Neal, in his opening comments, talked about the concern on our side about a study. We are the Committee of Cognizance in charge of the most important, the number one insurance program for the nation, the number one anti-poverty program for the elderly, the number one anti-poverty program for children. More veterans rely on Social Security disability than they do on the VA. It is our responsibility. I can remember the venerated Sam Johnson talking from his heart about how important, and he brought an extra special veterans perspective on this. And there will be different paths that people choose to select, whether it's solvency, but for 52 years not to act on a program that is our cognizance, this is marvelous legislation and thoughtful, et cetera, but it does not get to the depth of the problem. The chairman cited 65 million, with 10,000 baby boomers a day becoming eligible. Will be beyond 70 million Americans, 5 million of whom get below poverty level checks from their government, who've worked and paid in all their lives. Their government, that's us. That's you and me. That is this committee's responsibility and cognizance. So, as Mr. Neal pointed out, the fierce urgency of now is never more apparent. We can do this together. Think about your time in office being able, every one of you has a card. On that card, it shows you how much money comes into your district monthly. This is the best economic development plan we could provide for our districts that directly goes to people who then directly spend it right back in the district that you represent. I applaud the efforts on this, but I would be remiss if I did not bring up the fact that a program that uses less than 1% administrative costs to run itself, instead of being lauded, gets attacked and cut instead of being pursued so that we can help out our fellow citizens. Those 10,000 baby boomers a day are going to be very much aware of the needs they have not been provided. And that's why I think this is so vitally important that this committee assume its responsibility and cognizance, and associated myself with the remarks of the Ranking Member Neal, but do thank the chairman for your eloquence at the start of just how critically important Social Security is to each and every member on this committee. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. And I agree that this is a very important piece of legislation. I come from a culture where large numbers of individuals get involved in clergy work and often work with very small groups and very small and limited individuals. And there's not a great deal of resource that is moved around in those circles. And these individuals, yet they give in and of themselves, performing this work. So I certainly agree that they should have the opportunity to change their mind about a decision that they had made. And I join with Mr. Larson in expressing appreciation for the eloquence of your comments during the opening. I thank you very much and yield back.
Thank you. Additional members to strike the last word? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, the question is on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably reports H.R. 6068 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 6068 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller, yes. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Ms. Tinney. Ms. Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal.
Yes.
Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett.
Yes.
Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson.
Aye.
Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson.
Yes.
Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer.
Aye.
Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, yes. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, yes. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer. Mr. Evans.
Yes.
Mr. Evans, yes. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, yes. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Byer. Chairman Smith.
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 41, the noes are 0.
There being 41 ayes and 0 noes, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6068, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 6068, and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we all know, we only have 24 hours in a day, and we can't be in 2 places at once. And unfortunately, I was in a classified briefing, so I missed 3 of our votes today: H.R. 5862, H.R. 1568, H.R. 5861. And for the record, I just want to say, had I been here, I would have voted yes on all 3.
Thank you, sir. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.